Alright, hello everyone. Welcome to the first episode of this new podcast series where we're going to talk about the many instances through a history of systemic oppression and racism in Canada. For our first episode, we're going to explore reconciliation and the idea of what this means. More specifically, we're going to look into Canada's history with truth and reconciliation with its Indigenous communities. We're going to be investigating and talking about what reconciliation is, the abuse towards the Indigenous peoples in the past, present, and the effects it has had, steps that have been taken, and the steps that need to be taken. We're going to explore all that and more onto the first episode of Injustice, the Path to Reconciliation. Okay then, so on to the episode. So we already mentioned in the intro that we're going to talk about what reconciliation means, and I want to start with that before we go into the connections this has to Indigenous communities, which we'll definitely cover a lot about later on in the episode, because to understand all of what we're going to talk about later on, we need to understand what reconciliation means. So a quick Google search or a dictionary definition is that reconciliation is the restoration of friendly relations between two peoples, or more peoples. However, the word is often confused with the word forgiveness. So that begs the question, what's the difference between reconciliation and forgiveness? Well, the key difference is that reconciliation is the responsibility of those who caused the trauma that made the need for reconciliation to take the appropriate actions to repair those relationships. Whereas forgiveness is something for those who have been abused to choose to give after the appropriate actions have been taken to repair those relationships. So now that we've discussed what reconciliation is, and that we mentioned that's the responsibility of those who caused the need for it, I feel like a very important step in reconciliation to talk about why we need it and why we need to be taking these steps, or else the point can be kind of lost on us. This section is going to be discussing a lot of very hard to talk about topics, as there's a very long and terrible history of violence and abuse against Indigenous peoples in Canada. I would like to put in a trigger warning for this next part, as we're going to be talking about topics like murder, trauma, and sexual abuse of children, many more topics similar to that. If you are struggling with things like this may not be the episode for you. There are many resources that you can look into for that, but we are going to continue with the episode as planned. So, this section is so difficult to talk about, not only because of how terrible all this stuff has been, but also because talking about these events must be done with a very great amount of care. Because if you fail to show the empowering parts of Indigenous communities, you risk reinforcing that narrative of victimhood that has followed Indigenous communities quite a lot throughout history, of how instead of being seen as people or a beautiful culture, they're seen only as the products of the trauma that has been inflicted upon them. However, if you fail to talk about the proper amount of this trauma, you risk underplaying the consequences that this abuse has had on the peoples. The history of abuse towards the Indigenous peoples of Canada is so long and complicated that I'm not able to cover everything in one episode. So, I'm going to be talking about the most well-known and significant events. By far the most well-known instance of abuse towards Indigenous peoples and families is the horrible legacy that was left behind by the residential school system. The residential schools were Christian boarding schools and were supported and even funded by the Canadian government's Department of Indian Affairs. They had the purpose of assimilating the Indigenous population and to eradicate the culture of the Indigenous peoples. The residential school system ran from the early 1800s till the late 1990s, with the first one opening in 1831 and the last one closing in 1996, which was the Gordon Residential School in Saskatchewan. While operational, 1,500,000 Indigenous children were taken from communities and were taken to the schools, where they were exposed to cruelty, abuse, and neglect, all with the aim of ripping their culture away from them. At the schools, it was thought that over 6,000 children died due to a number of causes like malnourishment and disease. However, the staggering loss of life was not the only trauma that has remained with the families and communities of those who were sent to the schools. Young boys had their hair cut short as a way to take their culture away. Children were forbidden from speaking their own language. Children were subjected to terrible physical, mental, verbal, and sexual abuse at the hands of those running the schools. The lasting effects from these traumas at residential school have left many people, families, and communities traumatized and untrusting of the government and schools. So, in case it isn't clear, the ultimate goal of all this abuse, especially in the case of the residential schools, is to eradicate the culture of these people itself. The most common way in our history that has been done is not through genocide like many groups throughout history, like the Nazis or Stalin's USSR and many other examples, but has been through the use of assimilation. And the residential schools were not the only instance of Indigenous children being taken away from their families. Indigenous children make up about 7 to 8% of the children in Canada. However, Indigenous children make up almost 50% and to 54% of the statistics in the foster care system and child welfare system. And it has been this way for a very long time, even with recent years not showing any improvement and in this getting worse. And in the 1960s all the way to the 1980s and 90s, and possibly up until present day, Indigenous children were removed from their homes and placed in the foster care system and adoption systems. This event was so widespread, and the effects are still being felt today by the victims and families of the victims. While Indigenous media is often underrepresented in pop culture today, a piece of media that I saw that I feel represents the distrust of the system that a lot of Indigenous people feel is the show North of North. This show tells the story of an Inuit family in the far north of Canada, and the main character's mother, Nibi, gives a lot of insight into the abuse towards Indigenous people in the past, with a lot of things she says throughout the show, with one of them relating to the point about residential schools, being that she's not a big fan of schools. She says in response to being asked by a teacher why she's so uncomfortable at her granddaughter's school. While the show is fictional, this is a very real thing that a lot of people have had to go through, where they feel a uneasiness around schools due to the past trauma that they had to deal with. She gives much more insight into a lot of these issues that affect Indigenous peoples, like in the last episode, where we learned that before her daughter, the main character of the show, she had another daughter with an elderly white man when she was young. This also gives us some insight into how young Indigenous women are often targeted for abuse of this kind, where elderly white men typically will target them due to an over-sexualized representation of them in a lot of media and ideas about the Indigenous peoples. And we also learned that the man took her child away from her after she was born. This is going to lead to our next point about how a lot of Indigenous people and children are taken away from their families. And we're going to be especially talking about the 60s scoop. Due to the effects of the 60s scoop being so widespread, this is a very common feeling that a lot of people have had to deal with, of not feeling like they belong to their culture. And this is a feeling that the writer Francine Cunningham, an award-winning writer, wrote a poem called On Identity, where the first line that she writes down is, "It's hard to feel power from my ancestors when I don't know who they are," which I feel perfectly summarizes the feelings that I personally have about my indigeneity, and what I believe a lot of people are also feeling. Now, it's important to note that Francine never actually specifically tells us that she was a part of the 60s scoop, or that she was related to someone taken in the 60s scoop or had any connection to it. However, whether she is or isn't a victim of the scoop, I feel this still goes to show how so many Indigenous people have still had this experience or thought that they aren't belonging to that culture, even if they weren't taken in the scoop and were just disconnected other ways. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, we're not able to cover everything that has ever happened to Indigenous people, all the abuse and trauma and hardships that they've faced, because it's such a long history of this. However, we wanted to take a break from the history of this and go on to what is happening right now in our own communities all across Canada. Because to believe that all this trauma and things that have impacted the Indigenous communities negatively is only rooted in the past would be a gross oversight of everything that is still happening in the Indigenous communities and all the problems that are still present. Even as recently as, present day, there's been terrible conditions on reservations and in Indigenous communities with higher rates of child mortality, poverty, incarceration, and even suicide. The movie The Grizzlies shows how prevalent the suicide epidemic was, and while it has gotten better since, the rates are much higher than predominantly white communities, with the 2011 to 2016 being 3 times the suicide rates of white communities. Of course, also, as well known, the statistics for missing and murdering and raped Indigenous people, especially women, is far higher than that of predominantly white communities, as well as a shocking trend that the justice system often takes the investigations less seriously in cases a lot less vigorously pursued. Rape is about power, and the justice system, to ignore or not exercise due process in cases against Indigenous victims, further takes that power away after it's already been stripped away from them so much by what has happened to them and what has been happening to them for so many decades. Alright, that was a very long section talking about all the trauma and abuse that Indigenous people have gone through, and we wanted to try to move away from that, going on to what has been done by the government and the people of Canada to try and get back to this idea of reconciliation and forgiveness. What actions have been taken to try to repair that friendly relations? So, one of the biggest steps that really set off a chain of a lot of actions that were taken by both Indigenous people and the government was an act put forward by the government called the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which is a legal agreement referred to as the IRSSA. It was set up as a way for survivors of the residential school system to get compensation for a lot of their experiences and traumas, with 2 different ways that they can be eligible for compensation, being the CEP, which is the Common Experience Payment, and the IAP, which is the Individual Assessment Payment. So, basically, what that did was that the Common Experience Payment was a thing that went out to all people that were present at residential schools and survived, and I believe also the families of the people who attended residential schools, whereas the IAP, the Individual Assessment Payment, took in specific cases of very specific and particularly terrible abuse that happened to people that was brought forward to them, where they were entitled to a larger payout after the situation was being assessed. So a lot of cases like this revolved around physical or sexual abuse or extreme mental abuse also, which, while happened to a lot, in some cases, as many things like this, were particularly worse for some individuals. The IRSSA also caused the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the NCTR, which have both been powerful voices to call attention to the issues facing Indigenous communities, where the TRC was a group of people who were putting forward acts and bringing attention towards everything that happened, and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation being a central hub for information so that we can bring all this to light. And a lot of the research in this podcast has been from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, where they've compiled stories of survivors, historical events, all of this stuff to try and bring this truth to be accessible to the public in the information age. The most well-known way that the TRC has drawn attention to the mistreatment from the government was the 94 calls to action, which a lot of people know about, but essentially is a list of 94 actions that the government need to take in several different areas in different categories that we're going to cover soon, which are the two categories that are mainly sorted into are legacy, which includes all branches of child welfare, education, language and culture, health, and justice, all talking about how those were taken away or how they need to be rectified. And the second category is reconciliation, which is a much longer category, which includes the Canadian government and the United Nations Declaration of the Rights on Indigenous People, the Royal Proclamation and the Covenant of Reconciliation, the settlement agreement parties of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, equity for Aboriginal people in the legal system, National Council for Reconciliation, professional development and training for public servants, church apologies and reconciliation, education for reconciliation, youth programs, museums and archives, missing children and burial information, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, commemoration, media and reconciliation, sports and reconciliation, business and reconciliation, and finally, several actions on newcomers to Canada. Now, as with many other topics, this is such a wide topic that we don't have enough time in this episode to be able to cover everything that we just listed out. And so if you're interested in these, they are all on the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation's website. All these categories I just listed were pulled directly from their website and are all available to be read over there. One thing that I wanted to talk about, the 94 calls to action, is that one thing particularly powerful about them is that every single action and every single call begins with, we call upon the federal government to whatever the call is related to. Which brings us back to what we said at the start of the episode, in that reconciliation is the responsibility of those who caused the trauma to ensure. So they're not placing the responsibility of this on the people that were affected or on people who are just descendants of people who did this. They're talking straight to the government, the national government of Canada, to be able to properly rectify the direct trauma they have caused. Obviously, it wasn't the government that we have today, but it was still the responsibilities of past governments, and that is the responsibility of the government today to be able to take these proper actions to fix the damage that they have caused. One of the most important steps to reconcile, especially for an issue where the truth about the situation is kept hidden, like it was in the residential schools in the 60s scoop, where people knew about it, but they didn't know the true extent of what was happening at it until very recently, with new unmarked graves coming up in very recent years. And this is why every year in Canada, on November 30th, we have two national days, not exactly holidays, but celebration days. There is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and Orange Shirt Day, which the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation considers as two different things, where the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is about learning and talking about all the truth that is surrounded the residential schools and generally all the abuse that has happened towards Indigenous people. And Orange Shirt Day, even though it's on the same day, is to recognize everything that has been taken away in the loss of culture, which stems from a story about a girl being taken to residential schools who was bought a orange shirt by her mother and was taken away from her when she got to the school, and she was forced to wear the school uniforms. So these days both spark the popular slogan that the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and other organizations use, which is that every child matters, no matter the race, gender, or anything about them, every single child matters. In terms of the survivors of the 60s scoop, the attempts at reconciliation have been even less than that of what the survivors for the residential school system saw, with an infamously inadequate apology from the Manitoba government for supporting the part they played in the 60s scoop. The federal government even offered a form of compensation, but it was seen as falling very short of what the survivors truly deserve, especially when taken into the context of what was offered to residential school survivors. Many survivors of the scoop see the actions, or lack thereof, as belittling or insulting compared to what was done for the survivors of residential schools, which almost pitted survivors against each other, which is a possible strategy to continue to turn the communities against themselves. Many have called for more to be done by the government. However, many have been left with a feeling of their experiences being less important than others, as we just mentioned. In regards to the problems that Indigenous communities face that is still ongoing, the government has increased the amount of spending to improve conditions in Indigenous communities, almost tripling them what they used to be, including dedicating money to building new houses on reservations. However, once again, this is seen as not enough action from the government, and many say that more needs to be done. The government has also committed to a national plan to be giving more attention to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis, that with one of the largest steps being taking control of the Highway 16 action plan. Highway 16 is known as the Highway of Tears and is infamous for many Indigenous women and girls going missing on the highway. A large part of this is being forced to hitchhike as transportation was not available, which is part of what the action plan aims to do, providing more transportation so that women don't have to hitchhike, and also installing surveillance cameras all along the highway to try to deter these violent crimes against them. As individuals, we need to continue learning and talking about the stories and history of these people. To finish the episode, I want to quote Morgan Freeman in his statement to the Times in 2023 about Black History Month. He said, "To relegate my history to a month is an insult. Black history is American history." I believe that we as Canadians should take this approach in the same way, not just talking about Indigenous history like the residential schools or the 60s scoop on November 30th on National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, not to ignore this truth about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in our country. To face these hard facts and reconcile, we as a country need to recognize how we have treated the Indigenous people, who are, above all else, other Canadians who have not been showed the same respect to be treated as Canadians. Thank you very much for tuning in to the first episode of Injustice. We use many sources such as the Canadian Encyclopedia, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, the Indigenous Residential School History and Dialogue Centre, the Veneer Institute of the Family, People Magazine, North of North, and On Identity by Francine Cunningham. Tune back in next week for the next episode, where we're going to be looking at the Canadian and American Japanese internment camps during the Second World War and the effects that they've had on the Japanese population of today. But for now, this has been Injustice, a path towards reconciliation.